Hello and welcome to Movies with Swords. My name's Kess, and today we're going to look at a 20th century adaptation of a 19th century novel about 12th century events. It's 1952's Ivanhoe. This review will go in depth to examine the context of the film and history, and therefore will contain spoilers. The short, spoiler-free review is this. The 1952 Ivanhoe is good, but not great. A 6 out of 10 if you're into that. A perfectly watchable mid-20th century medieval movie, but not the best of its kind. The rest of this review is going to be full of spoilers, 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 spoilers. You have been warned. The novel was published in 1819 by Sir Walter Scott and was an immediate commercial success. It helped usher in a major revival of interest in the medieval period that the later Victorian period would become enamored with, for better or for worse. On the one hand, the Victorians looked fondly on the pastoral nature of the past and the ideals of courtly love and chivalry. On the other, they also viewed it as a time of primitive ignorance, where people didn't wash at all, and knights had to be hoisted onto their horses with cranes. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between, except for the crane part, that's just silly. Still, whether intentional or not, the Victorians ended up spreading a lot of myths about the period that are demonstrably false, but commonly accepted. But back to the novel. Scott created a fictional and virtuous knight who is a loyal servant of King Richard the Lionheart and becomes the prime mover in raising the money to ransom his king from imprisonment in Austria and opposing the king's wicked brother Prince John. It also adds Jews to a prominent and sympathetic place in the narrative, being written in a time where English Jews were seeking and steadily gaining more political and civil rights. Scott was also a Scotsman, and the Saxon-Norman cultural conflict so central to the story is more of a reflection on Anglo-Scottish relations than any actual Saxon-Norman friction in the 12th century. The novel remained Scott's most popular work after his death. 3 silent films were made before the 1952 remake. This was directed by Richard Thorpe and involved script contributions by Noel Langley, Marguerite Roberts, and Aeneas Mackenzie. The big draw was the glamorous pairing of Robert and Elizabeth Taylor. No relation. Robert Taylor plays Wilfred of Ivanhoe, an Anglo-Saxon knight who is deeply loyal to King Richard I, played by Norman Wooland. Disguised as a wandering minstrel, Ivanhoe finds the king imprisoned by Leopold of Austria, who has captured Richard and is holding him for an actual king's ransom. The other major players of the story are as follows. The prime villain is Prince John, played by Guy Rolfe, who's cruel and slimy and has no interest in ransoming his brother. Ivanhoe also has to deal with a stormy reunion with his father Cedric of Ivanhoe, played by Finlay Currie, Wilfred's dad, who's pro-Saxon to the point of prejudice and disowned his son for going off on a Norman crusade. The Lady Rowena, played by Joan Fontaine, is Wilfred's one true love and, conveniently, the ward of Cedric of Ivanhoe. Wilfred loves her, but she kind of takes a back seat to his mission to save the king. Wamba, played by Emlyn Williams, the official court fool of the House of Ivanhoe. Like most jesters, he's there to drop wise observations about what's going on in the story. He's also got a servant's collar around his neck that Ivanhoe removes when he makes Wamba his squire, which I don't think is an actual historical thing. I haven't seen anything about that, ever. So, I'm calling BS on that. Especially since being a court fool is actually kind of a good gig, if you can get it. There's also Locksley, played by Harold Warrender. He ticks off the usual Locksley stuff. He lives in Sherwood Forest, he has a small army of archers, he robs rich noblemen who are passing through said forest. I should note that the portrayal of Robin Hood as a dispossessed noble who supports King Richard, like in this movie, is a later addition to the Robin Hood legends, one that Scott and subsequent writers ran with. Locksley's a side character here, but he does have a spy net, which is actually pretty fun. Ivanhoe has to turn to unorthodox means of finance to raise Richard's ransom, which turns out to mean Isaac of York, played by Felix Aylmer, a Jewish merchant whom Ivanhoe saves from some Norman robbers. Initially distrustful of the Saxons, he becomes one of Wilfred's most important allies. Isaac has a beautiful daughter, Rebecca, played by Elizabeth Taylor. She's trained in healing arts, which come in handy when Ivanhoe gets his ass handed to him in a tournament. She also happens to fall in love with our hero while she's nursing him back to health, because Wilfred and Rowena making doe eyes at each other all movie long would be boring. Later, she becomes a central character because she gets captured and put on trial for witchcraft because of her healing skills, until Wilfred comes to her rescue. We've also got Sir Hugh de Bracy, played by Robert Douglas, and Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert, played by George Sanders, as two of John's biggest Norman supporters. Brian's the more important one, as he's already got a grudge against Ivanhoe, and then also falls in love with Rebecca, creating a love quadrangle. There's not much to Wilfred of Ivanhoe. He's serious and steadfast and committed to his goal of rescuing Richard the entire length of the movie. He's committed to Rowena the entire time as well. He also doesn't smile much. About the only character growth he really has is that he learns to respect the Jews more. He does, on the other hand, have a rocking goatee, so points for that. The armor is very hit and miss. The great helms used during the jousts are actually pretty bad and fly off their wearers' heads at the very first impact, which kind of negates the entire purpose of wearing a great helm. The shields are metal, which is an anachronism. They would have been wooden. Minor gripe, I know, but worth pointing out. They do make a nice clanging sound when hit, so that's probably why they went with that, in addition to, well, wood tends to splinter when it breaks, so to protect the actors, they probably went with metal. What's nice is that for the final duel, nobody uses a sword. Bois Guilbert uses a flail. He calls it a mason chain, which is basically the same thing. And it looks really cool in motion, being all spiky and sinister looking, which is appropriate for a villain. More surprising is Ivanhoe using a battle axe. Sure, it's probably made of rubber and thicker than an actual battle axe would be, but kudos to giving the hero a weapon other than a sword for the big finale. I ragged on the helms, but the rest of the armor is actually pretty good. Chain with surcoats. The only real oddity is when you can see the actors' ears under their chain coifs. They would have had a padded cap underneath. For comparison, here's an Osprey illustration of a knight from the time period. The movie's actually pretty close, which is impressive. As you can also see, we're not quite at Great Helm territory yet, but the helmet is evolving in that direction. The castle siege. Oh, where to begin? It's by turns exciting because the Miklos Rosa score is rousing and there's a lot of action going on, but it's also completely absurd. The whole point of a castle is to allow a relatively small group of defenders fend off a group of people not willing to commit to a long and costly siege. Here, Locksley just decides, "Get 'em!" And a bunch of unarmored archers are able to storm the castle with a few ladders in an afternoon. Well, Ivanhoe starting a fire inside helped too, but logistically it's still really absurd. I already mentioned the weird collar Wamba wore, but let's focus on him again. He's the comic relief and easily the most likable character, especially as he starts to respect himself more as a human being under Ivanhoe's tutelage. That's all thrown out since he gets killed off during the siege when the villainous lord of the castle overpowers him and shoves him into a room that's on fire. Wamba runs off camera and screams, signifying his death. It's a weird moment because the comic relief character is killed in an offhand manner and the movie promptly forgets about his sacrifice. In a way, though, it makes perfect sense. A knight who spent most of his life training in combat skills is rushed by an unarmored man with no martial training whatsoever. It's only natural that Wamba gets wrecked in his first and only fight. I'm not sure a harsh lesson in the realities of combat was intended by the filmmakers, though. The whole Saxon versus Norman culture war story element doesn't have much of a historical leg to stand on. After the Norman conquest of 1066, a large number of Anglo-Saxon nobility were dispossessed and left England. The rest integrated into the new order of things because they wanted to hold on to their land. Eventually, they intermarried and everybody in the upper class spoke French because it was the fashionable thing to do. Outside of the Normans bringing French-style feudalism to the island, life for the peasants continued about the same. Land needed farming. The sheriffs and tax collectors still spoke English on a local level. King Richard himself identified with France more than he ever did with England and spent most of his reign at war, which taxed England heavily. Still, Richard was an accomplished general and one of the best siege masters of his day, which is what got him mythologized as a hero king more fondly remembered than his brother John, who was simply a bad king who got strong-armed by his barons into signing the Magna Carta, and an even worse military commander who lost huge tracts of France to Philip II. The English crown's relationship with the Jews is an interesting one. Medieval English Jews were a small portion of the population, concentrated mostly in urban centers like London and York. Since they were Jewish, they didn't answer to the church or pope as a spiritual authority, and in England at least, this translated to the notion that English Jews owed their sole allegiance to the King of England. The king acted as patron and de facto protector of the Jews, meaning that their well-being was dependent on the king's good favor, and since even then the Jews had a reputation for mercantile skills, the kings wanted them on their side since they could pay significant taxes. It also meant that in the frequent flare-ups between kings and barons, the barons and many of their direct subjects were not on the Jews' side, meaning things could get very ugly at times. That friction between barons and kings over the status of the Jews ended in 1290 when King Edward I was kind of pressured into giving the ultimatum for Jews to convert or leave England. Richard's relationship with the Jews reflected this status quo, though he did bar women and Jews from his coronation in 1189. When several Jewish leaders arrived with gifts anyway, they were violently flung out. Then London erupted in violent anti-Jewish riots because a rumor had spread that Richard had died. Richard condemned the riots, and eventually they died down. He punished the worst offenders and issued an edict to leave the Jews alone while he was on crusade. This didn't happen, and several more riots occurred outside of London, with a particularly bloody one in York. Richard's chief justiciar, William Longchamp, clamped down on the rioters with a firm fist. At least one prominent person was executed, and assorted clerks, sheriffs, and a few nobles were removed from their positions in Yorkshire. It was a display that Richard didn't like having his commands disobeyed, even while he was away, although Longchamp himself wasn't exactly a friend of the Jews. They were taxed heavily during Richard's crusade. As an aside, it should be noted that John would continue to uphold the tradition of royal tolerance for the Jews. It made sense. John had even more troubles with the barons and the Pope than Richard ever did, so why alienate a group of people who were already dependent upon his goodwill? I should mention the man who captured King Richard I. His name was Duke Leopold V of Austria, and he had legitimate beef with Richard. The two were at the Siege of Acre in the Holy Land, one of the major battles of the Third Crusade. Leopold was one of the more prominent leaders of the remnants of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's army, Barbarossa famously dying in a river somewhere in Turkey. And after the city of Acre was taken in 1191, the flags of Jerusalem, England, France, and Austria were raised above the city, until Richard had Leopold's flag taken down because he was only a duke and not a king. Highly insulted, Leopold stormed off for home, and Richard would be later implicated in the assassination, and I literally mean assassination, as in by the Hashashin, of the newly elected King of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat, who was a major player in the Crusader states at the time, and Leopold's cousin. After capturing Richard in 1192, Leopold turned him over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, and Richard was eventually ransomed in 1194, the money being raised in large part by his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine and William Longchamp. His brother John conspired with Philip II of France on a counteroffer to delay Richard's release, but the emperor didn't take it. The money went to civic projects. Leopold was excommunicated by the Pope for imprisoning a fellow crusader, and would die in 1194 of infection after a foot was amputated after an injury at tournament. So now you know. The movie does spectacle very well. Crowd scenes are nice and vibrant, with a great variety of color and pageantry where needed, while the peasants are appropriately dressed in undyed fabrics. There's a level of vibrance there that is solely missing from a lot of modern medieval films. The jousting is great, helmets notwithstanding. They're fast and the stuntmen hit the ground hard. The impact is increased by the absence of the soundtrack during collision. The impact is also increased by the lack of slow motion that, hey, guess what, a lot of modern movies abuse. The final duel is even better, since we get into the dirt with melee combat. The weapon choices are refreshing, and it has the emotional weight of the grudge between Ivanhoe and Bois Guilbert that's been simmering the entire movie. Speaking of Bois Guilbert, he is easily the most fascinating character. George Sanders' performance... Oh, and I should note that George Sanders played Shere Khan in Disney's The Jungle Book, so that's where you've heard his voice before. Sanders' performance is a bit understated, as is everyone's save Wamba's, but he's actually got a significant character arc. He starts out as a proud and aloof Norman knight who proves to be patient, crafty, and a worthy foil for Ivanhoe. He too was on crusade with Richard, and that was where their grudge first took root. Then he falls in love with Rebecca and starts to use trickery and deception to get close to her. He also tries his best to save her from the pyre, as best as his loyalty to John will allow him. He even offers to forfeit the trial by combat at the end, sacrificing his own honor and social status if only Rebecca would go with him, and love him, as he loves her. But she refuses. Spurned and heartbroken, he goes into murder mode against Ivanhoe, and is dealt a mortal blow. His last words are a stoic acceptance of the cruelty of the fates, and a final declaration of his love for Rebecca. Now that's a medieval character, a strong, worthy knight brought down by a doomed love for a beautiful woman and his own pride. Yes, he's technically the villain, but Ivanhoe does not get that kind of development at all. Now the book handles Bois Guilbert differently, making him more clearly a villain and even going so far as to make him a Templar, which is hilarious from a historical standpoint since they were sworn to celibacy, but that's a discussion for another time. The confrontation of anti-Semitism within the movie is interesting. The medievals themselves largely viewed the Jews as an other most of the time. Many, especially in rural areas, never saw a Jew in their lives. They dressed differently, worshipped differently, and were mysterious. In historical records, they often show up as victims of civil unrest or riots. This was especially true during the Crusades. It was not a uniform thing, though. There are also accounts of tolerance and even friendship between Christians and Jews, or of a bishop giving sanctuary to Jews during riots and so forth. The reality of the situation was often complicated. Making the Jews sympathetic in Ivanhoe is refreshing and helps differentiate this story from, say, Chaucer or Malory. And it was also fairly bold for 1819-1820. Now, of course, Rebecca gets a lonely end in the movie. One love interest is dead, and the other friend-zoned her a long time ago, but compared to her, Rowena is a block of wood of personality. Let's not forget that this movie was also released less than a decade after World War II. Hey, a story that urges tolerance of people who are different from each other but bear no real malice is always a good thing. As I said earlier, this Ivanhoe movie is good, but not great. It delivers brightly colored spectacle in glorious technicolor. The score by Miklos Rosa is fantastic. The action sequences are well executed and entertaining. Though the siege remains silly, I'm sorry, I just can't let that one go. Brian de Bois-Guilbert is an excellent and layered character. Ivanhoe is a stick in the mud, and the love quadrangle gets thick with melodrama. On a historical level, this movie loses a lot of points, but I'm not going to call one of the most popular novels of the 19th century glorified fanfiction, even though it kind of is. The individual parts of the movie that work are fantastic, but for me the sum was less than its parts, and it lacks the unbridled fun of something like The Adventures of Robin Hood, which came out 20 years before this. I can recommend it as a well-executed but loosely historical adventure drama, but it's not the best of its kind. So there you go, Ivanhoe. This has been Movies with Swords. I'm Kes, and thanks for watching.
My heart was a lion, but now it is chained. Far do I travel, and with travel am stained.